The 80-20 principle is also consistent with, and can be explained by reference to, the feedback loops identified by chaos theory, whereby small initial influences can become greatly multiplied and produce highly unexpected results, which nevertheless can be explained in retrospect. In the absence of feedback loops, the natural distribution of phenomena would be 50-50. Inputs of a given frequency would lead to commensurate results. It is only because of positive and negative feedback loops that causes do not have equal results. Yet, it also seems to be true that powerful positive feedback loops only affect a small minority of the inputs. This helps to explain why those small minority of inputs can exert so much influence. We can see positive feedback loops operating in many areas, explaining how it is that we typically end up with 80-20 rather than 50-50 relationships between populations. For example, the rich get richer, not just or mainly because of superior abilities, but because riches beget riches. A similar phenomenon exists with goldfish in a pond. Even if you start with goldfish almost exactly the same size, those that are slightly bigger become very much bigger because, even with only slight initial advantages in stronger propulsion and larger mouths, they are able to capture and gobble up disproportionate amounts of food. The tipping point. Related to the idea of feedback loops is the concept of the tipping point. Up to a certain point, a new force, whether it is a new product, a disease, a new rock group, or even a new social habit such as jogging or rollerblading, finds it difficult to make headway. A great deal of effort generates little by way of results. At this point, many pioneers give up. But if the new force persists and can cross a certain invisible line, a small amount of additional effort can reap huge returns. This invisible line is the tipping point. The concept comes from the principles of epidemic theory. The tipping point is the point at which an ordinary and stable phenomenon, a low-level flu outbreak, can turn into a public health crisis because of the number of people who are infected and can therefore infect others. And since the behavior of epidemics is non-linear and they don't behave in the way we expect, small changes, like bringing new infections down to 30,000 from 40,000, can have huge effects. It all depends when and how the changes are made. First come, best served. Chaos theory advocates sensitive dependence on initial conditions. What happens first, even something ostensibly trivial, can have a disproportionate effect. This resonates with, and helps to explain, the 80-20 principle. The latter states that a minority of causes exert a majority of effects. One limitation of the 80-20 principle, taken in isolation, is that it always represents a snapshot of what is true now, or more precisely, in the very recent past when the snapshot was taken. This is where chaos theory's doctrine of sensitive dependence on initial conditions is helpful. A small lead early on can turn into a larger lead or a dominant position later on, until equilibrium is disturbed and another small force then exerts a disproportionate influence. A firm that, in the early stages of a market, provides a product that is 10% better than its rivals may end up with 100 or 200% greater market share, even if the rivals later provide a better product. In the early days of motoring, if 51% of drivers or countries decide to drive on the right rather than the left of the road, this will tend to become the norm for nearly 100% of road users. In the early days of using a circular clock, if 51% of clocks go what we now call clockwise rather than counterclockwise, this convention will become dominant, although clocks could just as logically have moved to the left. In fact, the clock over Florence Cathedral moves counterclockwise and shows 24 hours. Soon after 1442, when the cathedral was built, the authorities and clockmakers standardized on a 12-hour clockwise clock because the majority of clocks had those features. Yet, if 51% of clocks had ever been like the clock over Florence Cathedral, we would now be reading a 24-hour clock backwards. These observations regarding sensitive dependence on initial conditions do not exactly illustrate the 80-20 principle. The examples given involve change over time, whereas the 80-20 principle involves a static breakdown of causes at any one time. Yet there is an important link between the two. Both phenomena help to show how the universe abhors balance. In the former case, we see a natural flight away from a 50-50 split of competing phenomena. A 51-49 split is inherently unstable and tends to gravitate towards a 95-5, 99-1, or even 100-0 split. Equality ends in dominance. That is one of the messages of chaos theory. The 80-20 principle's message is different yet complementary. It tells us that, at any one point, a majority of any phenomenon will be explained or caused by a minority of the actors participating in the phenomenon. 80% of the results come from 20% of the causes. A few things are important, most are not. The 80-20 principle sorts good movies from bad. One of the most dramatic examples of the 80-20 principle at work is with movies. Two economists made a study of the revenues and lifespans of 300 movies released over an 18-month period. They found that 4 movies, just 1.3% of the total, earned 80% of box office revenues. The other 296 movies, or 98.7%, earned only 20% of the gross. So movies, which are a good example of unrestricted markets at work, produce virtually an 80-1 rule, a very clear demonstration of the principle of imbalance. Even more intriguing is why. It transpires that moviegoers behave just like gas particles in random motion. As identified by chaos theory, gas particles, ping-pong balls or moviegoers all behave at random, but produce a predictably unbalanced result. Word of mouth from reviews and the first audiences determines whether the second set of audiences will be large or small, which determines the next set, and so on. Movies like Independence Day or Mission Impossible continue to play to packed houses, while other star-studded and expensive movies like Waterworld or Daylight very quickly play to smaller and smaller houses, and then none at all. This is the 80-20 principle working with a vengeance. A guide to this guidebook. Chapter 2 explains how you can put the 80-20 principle into practice and explores the distinction between 80-20 analysis and 80-20 thinking, both of which are useful methods derived from the 80-20 principle. 80-20 analysis is a systematic, quantitative method of comparing causes and effects. 80-20 thinking is a broader, less precise and more intuitive procedure comprising the mental models and habits that enable us to hypothesize what are the important causes of anything important in our lives, to identify these causes, and to make sharp improvements in our position by redeploying our resources accordingly. Part 2, Corporate Success Needn't Be a Mystery, summarizes the most powerful business uses of the 80-20 principle. These uses have been tried and tested and found to be of immense value, yet remain curiously unexploited by most of the business community. There is little in my summary that is original, but anyone seeking major profit improvement, whether for a small or large business, should find this a very useful primer and the first ever to appear in a book. Part 3, Work Less, Earn and Enjoy More, shows how the 80-20 principle can be used to raise the level at which you are operating in both your work and personal life. This is a pioneering attempt to apply the 80-20 principle on a novel canvas, and the attempt, although I am sure it is imperfect and incomplete in many ways, does lead to some surprising insights. For example, 80% of the typical person's happiness or achievement in life occurs in a small proportion of that life. The 80-20 principle also asserts that when we know the true relationship, we are likely to be surprised at how unbalanced it is. Whatever the actual level of imbalance, it is likely to exceed our prior estimate. Executives may suspect that some customers and some products are more profitable than others, but when the extent of the difference is proved, they are likely to be surprised and sometimes dumbfounded. Teachers may know that the majority of their disciplinary troubles or most truancy arises from a minority of pupils, but if records are analysed, the extent of the imbalance will probably be larger than expected. We may feel that some of our time is more valuable than the rest, but if we measure inputs and outputs, the disparity can still stun us. Why should you care about the 80-20 principle? Whether you realise it or not, the principle applies to your life, to your social world, and to the place where you work. Understanding the 80-20 principle gives you great insight into what is really happening in the world around you. The overriding message of this book is that our daily lives can be greatly improved by using the 80-20 principle. Each individual can be more effective and happier. Each profit-seeking corporation can become very much more profitable. Each non-profit organisation can also deliver much more useful outputs. Every government can ensure that its citizens benefit much more from its existence. For everyone and every institution, it is possible to obtain much more that is of value and avoid what has negative value with much less input of effort, expense, or investment. At the heart of this progress is a process of substitution. Resources that have weak effects in any particular use are not used or are used sparingly. Resources that have powerful effects are used as much as possible. Every resource is ideally used where it has the greatest value. Wherever possible, weak resources are developed so that they can mimic the behaviour of the stronger resources. Business and markets have used this process to great effect for hundreds of years. The French economist J.B. Say coined the word entrepreneur around 1800, saying that the entrepreneur shifts economic resources out of an area of lower productivity into an area of higher productivity and yield. But one fascinating implication of the 80-20 principle is how far businesses and markets still are from producing optimal solutions. For example, the 80-20 principle asserts that 20% of products or customers or employees are really responsible for about 80% of profits. If this is true, and detailed investigations usually confirm that some such very unbalanced pattern exists, the state of affairs implied is very far from being efficient or optimal. The implication is that 80% of products or customers or employees are only contributing 20% of profits, that there is great waste, that the most powerful resources of the company are being held back by a majority of much less effective resources, that profits could be multiplied if more of the best sort of products could be sold, employees hired or customers attracted, or convinced to buy more from the firm. In this kind of situation, one might well ask, why continue to make the 80% of products that only generate 20% of profits? Companies rarely ask these questions, perhaps because to answer them would mean very radical action. To stop doing 4/5 of what you are doing is not a trivial change. What J.B. Say called the work of entrepreneurs, modern financiers call arbitrage. International financial markets are very quick to correct anomalies in valuation, for example, between exchange rates. But business organisations and individuals are generally very poor at this sort of entrepreneurship or arbitrage, at shifting resources from where they have weak results to where they have powerful results, or at cutting off low-value resources and buying more high-value resources. Most of the time, we do not realise the extent to which some resources, but only a small minority, are super productive. what Joseph Juran called the vital few, while the majority, the trivial many, exhibit little productivity or else actually have negative value. If we did realise the difference between the vital few and the trivial many in all aspects of our lives, and if we did something about it, we could multiply anything that we valued. The 80-20 principle and chaos theory. Probability theory tells us that it is virtually impossible for all the applications of the 80-20 principle to occur randomly, as a freak of chance. We can only explain the principle by positing some deeper meaning or cause that lurks behind it. Pareto himself grappled with this issue, trying to apply a consistent methodology to the study of society. He searched for theories that picture facts of experience and observation, for regular patterns, social laws or uniformities that explain the behaviour of individuals and society. Pareto's sociology failed to find a persuasive key. He died long before the emergence of chaos theory, which has great parallels with the 80-20 principle and helps to explain it. The last third of the 20th century saw a revolution in the way that scientists think about the universe, overturning the prevailing wisdom for the past 350 years. That prevailing wisdom was a machine-based and rational view, which itself was a great advance on the mystical and random view of the world which was held in the Middle Ages. The machine-based view converted God from being an irrational and unpredictable force into a more user-friendly clockmaker engineer. The view of the world held from the 17th century, and still prevalent today, except in advanced scientific circles, was immensely comforting and useful. All phenomena were reduced to regular, predictable, linear relationships. For example, A causes B, B causes C, and A plus C cause D. This worldview enabled any individual part of the universe, the operation of the human heart, for example, or of any individual market, to be analysed separately, because the whole was the sum of the parts, and vice versa. But in the 21st century, it seems much more accurate to view the world as an evolving organism where the whole system is more than the sum of its parts, and where relationships between the parts are non-linear. Causes are difficult to pin down. There are complex interdependencies between causes, and causes and effects are blurred. The snag with linear thinking is that it doesn't always work. It is an oversimplification of reality. Equilibrium is illusory or fleeting. The universe is wonky. Yet chaos theory, despite its name, does not say that everything is a hopeless and incomprehensible mess. Rather, there is a self-organizing logic lurking behind the disorder, a predictable non-linearity, something which economist Paul Krugman has called spooky, eerie, and terrifyingly exact. The logic is more difficult to describe than to detect, and is not totally dissimilar to the recurrence of a theme in a piece of music. Certain characteristic patterns recur, but with infinite and unpredictable variety. Chaos theory and the 80-20 principle illuminate each other. What have chaos theory and related scientific concepts got to do with the 80-20 principle? Although no one else appears to have made the link, I think the answer is a great deal. The principle of imbalance. The common thread between chaos theory and the 80-20 principle is the issue of balance, or more precisely, imbalance. Both chaos theory and the 80-20 principle assert, with a great deal of empirical backing, that the universe is unbalanced. They both say that the world is not linear. Cause and effect are rarely linked in an equal way. Both also place great store by self-organisation. Some forces are always more forceful than others and will try to grab more than their fair share of resources. Chaos theory helps to explain why and how this imbalance happens by tracing a number of developments over time. The universe is not a straight line. The 80-20 principle, like chaos theory, is based around the idea of non-linearity. A great deal of what happens is unimportant and can be disregarded. Yet there are always a few forces that have an influence way beyond their numbers. These are the forces that must be identified and watched. If they are forces for good, we should multiply them. If they are forces we don't like, we need to think very carefully about how to neutralize them. The 80-20 principle supplies a very powerful empirical test of non-linearity in any system. We can ask, do 20% of causes lead to 80% of results? Is 80% of any phenomenon associated with only 20% of a related phenomenon? This is a useful method to flush out non-linearity, but it is even more useful because it directs us to identifying the unusually powerful forces at work. Feedback loops distort and disturb balance. Richard Koch is a businessman. He discovered a truth, yes, a master plan. Write a book about it, became a hit. It's not only cool, it's also legit. The 80-20 principle is the title. The lessons it teaches you are vital. Sit back and listen to this sound bite. By the time that you're finished, you'll see the light. The 80-20 principle, the key to success. The 80-20 principle, achieve more with less. The 80-20 principle, the key to success. The 80-20 principle, achieve more. So what is the 80-20 principle? The 80-20 principle asserts that a minority, a small number of causes, inputs or effort usually leads to a majority of the results, outputs or rewards. So most of the outputs result from a very small part of the causes or inputs. The 80-20 principle, the key to success. The 80-20 principle, achieve more with less. The 80-20 principle, the key to success. The 80-20 principle, achieve more. Taken literally, this means that, for example, 80% of what we achieve in our job comes from 20% of the time we spend. Thus, for all practical purposes, 4/5 of our effort, pretty much all of it really, is largely irrelevant, and this is contrary, of course, to what we normally expect. The 80-20 principle, the key to success. The 80-20 principle, achieve more with less. The 80-20 principle, the key to success. The 80-20 principle, achieve more. So the 80-20 principle states that there is an inbuilt imbalance between causes and results, inputs and outputs, efforts and rewards. A good benchmark for this imbalance is provided by the 80-20 relationship. A typical pattern will show that 80% of outputs result from 20% of inputs. 80% of consequences flow from 20% of causes. Or 80% of results come from 20% of effort. In business, many examples of the 80-20 principle have been validated. 20% of products usually account for about 80% of dollar sales, so do 20% of customers. And 20% of products or customers also usually account for 80% of an organization's profits. The 80-20 principle, the key to success. The 80-20 principle, achieve more with less. The 80-20 principle, the key to success. The 80-20 principle, achieve more. Part 1. Overture. The universe is wonky. What is the 80-20 principle? The 80-20 principle tells us that in any population, some things are likely to be much more important than others. A good benchmark or hypothesis is that 80% of results or outputs flow from 20% of causes, and sometimes from a much smaller proportion of powerful forces. Everyday language is a good illustration. Sir Isaac Pitman, who invented shorthand, discovered that just 700 common words make up 2/3 of our conversation. Including the derivatives of these words, Pitman found that these words account for 80% of common speech. In this case, fewer than 1% of words, the new shorter Oxford English Dictionary lists over 500,000 words, are used 80% of the time. We could call this an 81 principle. Similarly, Over 99% of talk uses fewer than 20% of words. We could call this a 99-20 relationship. The movies illustrate the 80-20 principle. A recent study shows that 1.3% of movies earn 80% of box office revenues, producing virtually an 81 rule. The 80-20 principle is not a magic formula. Sometimes the relationship between results and causes is closer to 70-30 than to 80-20 or 80-1. But it is very rarely true that 50% of causes lead to 50% of results. The universe is predictably unbalanced. Few things really matter. Truly effective people and organizations batten on to the few powerful forces at work in their worlds and turn them to their advantage. Keep listening to find out how you can do the same. Chapter 1. Welcome to the 80-20 principle. For a very long time, the Pareto law, the 80-20 principle, has lumbered the economic scene like an erratic block on the landscape, an empirical law which nobody can explain. Joseph Steindl. The 80-20 principle can and should be used by every intelligent person in their daily life, by every organization, and by every social grouping and form of society. It can help individuals and groups achieve much more with much less effort. The 80-20 principle can raise personal effectiveness and happiness. It can multiply the profitability of corporations and the effectiveness of any organization. It even holds the key to raising the quality and quantity of public services while cutting their cost. This book, the first ever on the 80-20 principle, is written from a burning conviction validated in personal and business experience that this principle is one of the best ways of dealing with and transcending the pressures of modern life. What is the 80-20 principle? The 80-20 principle asserts that a minority of causes, inputs or effort usually lead to a majority of the results, outputs or rewards. Taken literally, this means that, for example, 80% of what you achieve in your job comes from 20% of the time spent. Thus, for all practical purposes, 4/5 of the effort, a dominant part of it, is largely irrelevant. This is contrary to what people normally expect. So, the 80-20 principle states that there is an inbuilt imbalance between causes and results, inputs and outputs, and effort and reward. A good benchmark for this imbalance is provided by the 80-20 relationship. A typical pattern will show that 80% of outputs result from 20% of inputs, that 80% of consequences flow from 20% of causes, or that 80% of results come from 20% of effort. In business, many examples of the 80-20 principle have been validated. 20% of products usually account for about 80% of dollar sales value. So do 20% of customers. 20% of products or customers usually also account for about 80% of an organization's profits. In society, 20% of criminals account for 80% of the value of all crime. 20% of motorists cause 80% of accidents. 20% of those who marry comprise 80% of the divorce statistics. Those who consistently remarry and redivorce distort the statistics and give a lopsidedly pessimistic impression of the extent of marital fidelity. 20% of children attain 80% of educational qualifications available. In the home, 20% of your carpets are likely to get 80% of the wear. 20% of your clothes will be worn 80% of the time. And if you have an intruder alarm, 80% of the false alarms will be set off by 20% of the possible causes. The internal combustion engine is a great tribute to the 80-20 principle. 80% of the energy is wasted in combustion, and only 20% gets to the wheels. This 20% of the input generates 100% of the output. Pareto's discovery. systematic and predictable lack of balance. The pattern underlying the 80-20 principle was discovered in 1897, exactly 100 years ago, by Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, 1848 to 1923. His discovery has since been called many names, including the Pareto Principle, the Pareto Law, the 80-20 Rule, the Principle of Least Effort, and the Principle of Imbalance. Joseph Steindl. God plays dice with the universe, but they're loaded dice, and the main objective is to find out by what rules they were loaded and how we can use them for our own ends. Joseph Ford. We cannot be certain to what height the human species may aspire. We may therefore safely acquiesce in the pleasing conclusion that every age of the world has increased and still increases the real wealth, the happiness, the knowledge, and perhaps the virtue of the human race. Edward Gibbon. Preface to the second edition. I wrote this book in South Africa in 1996 and came to London in the so-called summer of 1997 to launch it. I remember traipsing from radio station to television station, usually to find that my slot had been pulled at the last minute. When I did get on the air, nobody seemed very interested in the findings of an obscure Italian economist in the dying years of the 19th century. "Ooh," one celebrity of the minute crooned on a talk show, "what are you doing here if you didn't come up with this idea yourself?" I would like to say that without missing a beat, I mentioned the influence of St. Paul and the Gospel writers in doing the heavy lifting for the ideas of one Jesus of Nazareth, who would otherwise have been unknown. I would like to say that, but in fact I was lost for words. I returned to Cape Town thoroughly dejected. And then, a minor miracle. The British publisher who had commissioned the work, a man well known for looking on the gloomy side, faxed me, remember faxes? To say that despite the PR fiasco, the book was selling very well. In fact, the book has sold more than 700,000 copies worldwide and been translated into 24 languages. More than a century since Vilfredo Pareto noted the consistently lopsided relationship between inputs and outputs, and a decade since this book reinterpreted Pareto's principle, I think we can now say that the principle has stood the test of time. There has been massive feedback, mainly positive, from readers and reviewers. Throughout the world, a large number of individuals, perhaps hundreds of thousands, have found the principle useful at work and in their careers, and increasingly in the whole of their lives. The 80-20 principle has two almost opposite appeals. On the one hand, it is a statistical observation, a proven pattern, solid, quantitative, reliable, hard. It pleases those who want to get more out of life, to get ahead of the crowd, to increase profits or decrease effort or costs in the pursuit of gain, to dramatically raise efficiency, defined as output divided by input. If we can spot the few cases where the results relative to effort are so much greater than usual, we can become so much more efficient in whatever task we want to accomplish. The principle allows us to enhance our achievement while escaping the tyranny of overwork. On the other hand, the principle has a totally different side. Soft, mystical, eerie, almost magic in the way that the same pattern of numbers crops up everywhere, and related not to efficiency at all, but to everything that makes our lives worthwhile. The sense that we are connected to each other and to the universe by a mysterious law, which we can tap into and which can change our lives, generates a sense of wonder and awe. Looking back, I think what was different about my book was that it extended the domain of the principle. It had previously been well known in the business arena to increase efficiency. As far as I know, it had never previously been deployed to enhance the quality and depth of our whole lives. It's only in retrospect that I have fully realized the dual nature of the principle, the curious but perfect tension between its two sides, hard efficiency and soft life enhancement. As I explore in the new chapter of the book, this tension represents the yin and yang of the principle, the dialectic where efficiency and life-enhancing uses of it are complementary opposites. Efficiency clears the space for life enhancement, while life enhancement requires us to be clear about the few things that are really important in our work, relationships, and all the other activities we do in our lives. Of course, not everyone accepted my reinterpretation of Pareto's principle. I was surprised at how controversial the book became. While it had its fierce supporters, and a huge number of quiet people who wrote to me saying the book had changed both their professional life and their life as a whole, there were many people who disliked the extension of the principle to the softer side of life, and said so with great clarity and eloquence. The opposition took me aback, but then I came to welcome the contrary voices. They have made me think about the principle more deeply, and, as I hope is demonstrated in the final chapter, reach a greater understanding of its dual nature. What is new about this edition? To start with, less is more. I have cut out the original final chapter, Progress Regained. This was a frankly unsuccessful attempt to apply the 80-20 principle to society and politics. Whereas every other part of the book generated both positive and negative comments, this chapter seems to have fallen entirely on stony ground. The only piece I have retained is the conclusion, which is an appeal to individuals to take action. I have replaced it with an entirely new chapter, the yin and yang of the principle. This covers the highlights generated by a decade of reviews, conversations, letters and emails, and amplifies and categorizes the best criticisms of the principle before giving my response. I believe this takes us to a new level of awareness and understanding of the power of the principle. It remains for me to thank everyone who has contributed to the great 80-20 debate. Long may it continue, and thank you all so much. I may have touched your lives, but you have certainly touched mine, and I am most grateful. Richard Koch. Richard Koch at btinternet.com. Estepona, Spain, February 2007. The 80-20 Rap. Did you know that there is an excellent 80-20 rap song, courtesy of the incomparable Wyatt Moe G. Jackson? You can listen to it on the web if you like at www.the8020principle.com. It lasts 3 minutes, like a pop song should. Here are the lyrics, which are interspersed with me summing up the message of this book. Throughout this book, we will call it the 80-20 principle. By a subterranean process of influence on many important achievers, especially business people, computer enthusiasts, and quality engineers, the 80-20 principle has helped to shape the modern world. Yet it has remained one of the great secrets of our time, and even the select band of cognoscenti who know and use the 80-20 principle only exploit a tiny proportion of its power. So what did Vilfredo Pareto discover? He happened to be looking at patterns of wealth and income in 19th century England. He found that most income and wealth went to a minority of the people in his samples. Perhaps there was nothing very surprising in this, but he also discovered two other facts that he thought highly significant. One was that there was a consistent mathematical relationship between the proportion of people, as a percentage of the total relevant population, and the amount of income or wealth that this group enjoyed. To simplify, if 20% of the population enjoyed 80% of the wealth, then you could reliably predict that 10% would have, say, 65% of the wealth, and 5% would have 50%. The key point is not the percentages, but the fact that the distribution of wealth across the population was predictably unbalanced. Pareto's other finding, one that really excited him, was that this pattern of imbalance was repeated consistently whenever he looked at data referring to different time periods or different countries. Whether he looked at England in earlier times or whatever data were available from other countries in his own time or earlier, he found the same pattern repeating itself over and over again with mathematical precision. Was this a freak coincidence or something that had great importance for economics and society? Would it work if applied to sets of data relating to things other than wealth or income? Pareto was a terrific innovator because before him, no one had looked at two related sets of data. In this case, the distribution of incomes or wealth compared to the number of income earners or property owners, and compared percentages between the two sets of data. Nowadays, this method is commonplace and has led to major breakthroughs in business and economics. Sadly, although Pareto realized the importance and wide range of his discovery, he was very bad at explaining it. He moved on to a series of fascinating but rambling sociological theories, centering on the role of elites, which were hijacked at the end of his life by Mussolini's fascists. The significance of the 80-20 principle lay dormant for a generation. While a few economists, especially in the US, realized its importance, it was not until after the Second World War that two parallel yet completely different pioneers began to make waves with the 80-20 principle. 1949, Zipf's principle of least effort. One of these pioneers was the Harvard professor of philology, George K. Zipf. In 1949, Zipf discovered the principle of least effort, which was actually a rediscovery and elaboration of Pareto's principle. Zipf's principle said that resources, people, goods, time, skills, or anything else that is productive, tended to arrange themselves so as to minimize work, so that approximately 20 to 30% of any resource accounted for 70 to 80% of the activity related to that resource. Professor Zipf used population statistics, books, philology, and industrial behavior to show the consistent recurrence of this unbalanced pattern. For example, he analysed all the Philadelphia marriage licenses granted in 1931 in a 20-block area, demonstrating that 70% of the marriages occurred between people who lived within 30% of the distance. Incidentally, Zipf also provided a scientific justification for the messy desk by justifying clutter with another law. Frequency of use draws near to us things that are frequently used. Intelligent secretaries have long known that files in frequent use should not be filed. 1951. Duran's rule of the vital few and the rise of Japan. The other pioneer of the 80-20 principle was the great quality guru, Romanian-born US engineer Joseph Moses Duran, born 1904, the man behind the quality revolution of 1950 to 90. He made what he alternately called the Pareto principle and the rule of the vital few virtually synonymous with the search for high product quality. In 1924, Duran joined Western Electric, the manufacturing division of Bell Telephone System, starting as a corporate industrial engineer and later setting up as one of the world's first quality consultants. His great idea was to use the 80-20 principle, together with other statistical methods, to root out quality faults and improve the reliability and value of industrial and consumer goods. Duran's path-breaking Quality Control Handbook was first published in 1951 and extolled the 80-20 principle in very broad terms. The economist Pareto found that wealth was non-uniformly distributed in the same way as Duran's observations about quality losses. Many other instances can be found: the distribution of crime amongst criminals, the distribution of accidents among hazardous processes, etc. Pareto's principle of unequal distribution applied to distribution of wealth and to distribution of quality losses. no major US industrialist was interested in Duran's theories. In 1953, he was invited to Japan to lecture and met a receptive audience. He stayed on to work with several Japanese corporations, transforming the value and quality of their consumer goods. It was only once the Japanese threat to US industry had become apparent, after 1970, that Duran was taken seriously in the West. He moved back to do for US industry what he had done for the Japanese. The 80-20 principle was at the heart of this global quality revolution. From the 1960s to the 1990s, progress from using the 80-20 principle. IBM was one of the earliest and most successful corporations to spot and use the 80-20 principle, which helps to explain why most computer systems specialists trained in the 1960s and 1970s are familiar with the idea. In 1963, IBM discovered that about 80% of a computer's time is spent executing about 20% of the operating code. The company immediately rewrote its operating software to make the most used 20% very accessible and user-friendly, thus making IBM computers more efficient and faster than competitors' machines for the majority of applications. Those who developed the personal computer and its software in the next generation, such as Apple, Lotus and Microsoft, applied the 80-20 principle with even more gusto to make their machines cheaper and easier to use for a new tranche of customers, including the now celebrated dummies who would previously have given computers a very wide berth. Winner take all. A century after Pareto, the implications of the 80-20 principle has surfaced in a recent controversy over the astronomic and ever-rising incomes going to superstars and those very few people at the top of a growing number of professions. Film director Steven Spielberg earned $165 million in 1994. Joseph Jamil, the most highly paid trial lawyer, was paid $90 million. Merely competent film directors or lawyers, of course, earn a tiny fraction of these sums. The 20th century has seen massive efforts to level incomes, but inequality, removed in one sphere, keeps popping up in another. In the USA from 1973 to 1995, average real incomes rose by 36%, yet the comparable figure for non-supervisory workers fell by 14%. During the 1980s, all of the gains went to the top 20% of earners, and a mind-boggling 64% of the total increase went to the top 1%. The ownership of shares in the US is also heavily concentrated within a small minority of households. 5% of US households own about 75% of the household sector's equity. A similar effect may be seen in the role of the dollar. Almost 50% of world trade is invoiced in dollars, far above America's 13% share of world exports. And while the dollar's share of foreign exchange reserves is 64%, the ratio of American GDP to global output is just over 20%. The 80-20 principle will always reassert itself unless conscious, consistent, and massive efforts are made and sustained to overcome it. Why the 80-20 principle is so important. The reason that the 80-20 principle is so valuable is that it is counterintuitive. We tend to expect that all causes will have roughly the same significance, that all customers are equally valuable, that every bit of business, every product, and every dollar of sales revenue is as good as any other, that all employees in a particular category have roughly equivalent value, that each day or week or year we spend has the same significance, that all our friends have roughly equal value to us, that all inquiries or phone calls should be treated in the same way, that one university is as good as another, that all problems have a large number of causes, so that it is not worth isolating a few key causes, that all opportunities are of roughly equal value, so that we treat them all equally. We tend to assume that 50% of causes or inputs will account for 50% of results or outputs. There seems to be a natural, almost democratic expectation that causes and results are generally equally balanced. And, of course, sometimes they are. But this 50-50 fallacy is one of the most inaccurate and harmful, as well as the most deeply rooted, of our mental maps. The 80-20 principle asserts that when two sets of data relating to causes and results can be examined and analysed, the most likely result is that there will be a pattern of imbalance. The imbalance may be 65-35, 70-30, 75-25, 80-20, 95-5, or 99.9, 0.1, or any set of numbers in between. However, the two numbers in the comparison don't have to add up to 100. The peaks of great personal value can usually be greatly expanded. The common view is that we are short of time. My application of the 80-20 principle suggests the reverse, that we are actually awash with time and profligate in its abuse. Part 4, Fresh Insights, the principle revisited, considers feedback I have received and how my thinking on the 80-20 principle has developed since the first edition of this book. Why the 80-20 principle brings good news. I want to end this introduction on a personal rather than a procedural note. I believe that the 80-20 principle is enormously hopeful. Certainly, the principle brings home what may be evident anyway, that there is a tragic amount of waste everywhere in the way that nature operates, in business, in society, and in our own lives. If the typical pattern is for 80% of results to come from 20% of inputs, it is necessarily typical too that 80%, the great majority of inputs, are having only a marginal 20% impact. The paradox is that such waste can be wonderful news if we can use the 80-20 principle creatively, not just to identify and castigate low productivity, but to do something positive about it. There is enormous scope for improvement by rearranging and redirecting both nature and our own lives. Improving on nature, refusing to accept the status quo, is the root of all progress, evolutionary, scientific, social, and personal. George Bernard Shaw put it well. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. The implication of the 80-20 principle is that output can be not just increased, but multiplied if we can make the low productivity inputs nearly as productive as the high productivity inputs. Successful experiments with the 80-20 principle in the business arena suggest that with creativity and determination, this leap in value can usually be made. There are two routes to achieving this. One is to reallocate the resources from unproductive to productive uses, the secret of all entrepreneurs down the ages. Find a round hole for a round peg, a square hole for a square peg, and a perfect fit for any shape in between. Experience suggests that every resource has its ideal arena, where the resource can be tens or hundreds of times more effective than in most other arenas. The other route to progress, the method of scientists, doctors, preachers, computer systems designers, educationalists, and trainers, is to find ways to make the unproductive resources more effective, even in their existing applications. To make the weak resources behave as though they were their more productive cousins. To mimic, if necessary by intricate rote learning procedures, the highly productive resources. The few things that work fantastically well should be identified, cultivated, nurtured, and multiplied. At the same time, the waste, the majority of things that will always prove to be of low value to man and beast, should be abandoned or severely cut back. As I've been writing this book and observed thousands of examples of the 80-20 principle, I have had my faith reinforced. Faith in progress, in great leaps forward, and in mankind's ability, individually and collectively, to improve the hand that nature has dealt. Joseph Ford comments, "God plays dice with the universe, but they're loaded dice, and the main objective is to find out by what rules they were loaded and how we can use them for our own ends." The 80-20 principle can help us achieve precisely that. Chapter 2. How to think 80-20. Chapter 1 explained the concept behind the 80-20 principle. This chapter will discuss how the 80-20 principle works in practice and what it can do for you. Two applications of the principle, 80-20 analysis and 80-20 thinking, provide a practical philosophy which will help you understand and improve your life. Definition of the 80-20 principle. The 80-20 principle states that there is an inbuilt imbalance between causes and results, inputs and outputs, and effort and reward. Typically, causes, inputs, or effort divide into two categories: the majority that have little impact, a small minority that have a major, dominant impact. Typically also, results, outputs, or rewards are derived from a small proportion of the causes, inputs, or effort aimed at producing the results, outputs, or rewards. The relationship between causes, inputs, or efforts on the one hand and results, outputs, or rewards on the other is therefore typically unbalanced. When this imbalance can be measured arithmetically, a good benchmark for the imbalance is the 80-20 relationship. 80% of results, outputs, or rewards are derived from only 20% of the causes, inputs, or effort. About 80% of the world's energy is consumed by 15% of the world's population, for example. 80% of the world's wealth is possessed by 25% of the world's people. In healthcare, 20% of your population base and or 20% of its disease elements will consume 80% of your resources. Let us imagine, for example, that a company has 100 products and has found out that the most profitable 20 products account for 80% of all profits. It might help here to picture two piles: a big pile of the 100 products the company makes and a pile of cash that represents the profits made. Just one profitable product, 1% of the total products, makes 20% of the profits. So, if you pull that particular widget out of the pile of products, you have to match it with the 20% of the money from the cash pile. If we continue counting the next most profitable product, and the next, until we have the profits from the top 20 products, we end up with two pairs of piles. The first pair has one small pile of the top 20 products, and one big pile of cash representing 80% of the profits. The second pair is the flip side of this. There's a big pile which is the company's other 80 products, and a small pile of cash to represent the profit they make, which is just 20% of total profits. The 80-20 numbers are only a benchmark, and the real relationship may be more or less unbalanced than 80-20. The 80-20 principle asserts, however, that in most cases the relationship is much more likely to be closer to 80-20 than to 50-50. If all of the products in our example made the same profit, then the relationship would be shown as corresponding piles of cash and products of equal size. The curious but crucial point is that when such investigations are conducted, imbalance is much more common than balance. Of course, the exact relationship may not be 80-20. 80-20 is both a convenient metaphor and a useful hypothesis, but it is not the only pattern. Sometimes 80% of the profits come from 30% of the products. Sometimes 80% of the profits come from 15% or even 10% of the products. The numbers compared do not have to add up to 100, but the picture usually looks unbalanced. There's a bigger pile of cash paired with a smaller pile of products, rather than piles of cash and goods of about the same size. It is perhaps unfortunate that the numbers 80 and 20 add up to 100. This makes the result look elegant, as indeed would a result of 50-50, 70-30, 99-1, or many other combinations. And it is certainly memorable. But it makes many people think that we are dealing with just one set of data. 100%. Well, this is not so. If 80% of people are right-handed and 20% are left-handed, this is not an 80-20 observation. To apply the 80-20 principle, you have to have two sets of data, both adding up to 100%, and one measuring a variable quantity owned, exhibited, or caused by the people or things making up the other 100%. What the 80-20 principle can do for you. Every person I have known who has taken the 80-20 principle seriously has emerged with useful and, in some cases, life-changing insights.